Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this series of videos, I'm here to give you as much practical advice as I can about world building. In the previous episode, I went over the unique relationship between fantasy and language, as well as some of the ways you might approach inventing your world's terminology to describe its special elements, like creatures, magical phenomena, technologies, and so on. This video is something of a complement to that because instead of the words that are unique to your setting, I want to focus on pretty much the opposite of that, which is vernacular. How do people in your world talk to each other day to day, and what does that say about their society, history, and culture? Now, before we get down that rabbit hole, I do want to make it clear that for the majority of stories, this is pretty much optional. If the idea of inventing idioms and speech patterns doesn't sound like it would meaningfully elevate the reading experience of your book, then you are free to use some variation of common English parlance, and most of your readers will be completely okay with that. And even for those of you who are planning on putting additional effort into this subject, I want to underline that the things I cover in this video are not meant to be a checklist, but rather a selection of topics for you to consider and then decide which of them would help you tell the best version of your story. So with that in mind, let's get into it. As I said, vernacular can give valuable insight into a culture, so the first thing you'll want to consider is what kind of culture that is and what are its defining influences. One of these influences is going to be the culture's environment. Now, in some cases, this can actually refer to the physical or geographical environment in which the culture exists. For example, a tribe of desert-dwelling nomads is probably not going to have a lot of phrases about many fish in the sea, or things snowballing out of control, or a man being the king of his castle. But that said, languages can and very often do borrow from each other, so the other thing you'll need to consider is which other cultures does this one interact with and what is the nature of that interaction. Is it friendly or is it hostile? Is it a mutual give and take, or is one of them clearly more dominant? Think about the influence of Latin in Europe or Chinese in East Asia. And keep in mind that cultural dominance absolutely does not require a full-on military occupation. As a matter of fact, cultures will often willingly adopt or even copy entire aspects of a different culture simply because of its prestige, like with French after the Enlightenment. And then, of course, cultures can influence each other through open conflict. If two countries have a history of animosity, then it can very easily happen that the name or demonym of one country starts being used in the other country as an insult, a swear word, or even a threat, depending on how the conflict played out. Besides these external factors, another significant cultural influence can be religion and superstition, or the lack thereof. When I started writing my first novel, one decision I made early on is that the country of Ardan, where the story takes place, is going to have a secular culture with no state religion to speak of. This seemingly minor choice ended up being surprisingly challenging when it came to writing organic-sounding dialogue, because suddenly a whole range of expressions was completely off the table. Things like, "Oh my God," "Thank goodness," "Heaven forbid," "For Pete's sake," "What the hell," and so on. I ended up having to consciously train myself to pay attention to my dialogue as I was reading and editing, specifically to notice these idioms and swap them out with a non-religious alternative. And then last, but by no means the least, one of the greatest influences on a culture and its language is social structure. And this goes far beyond the basic divide between proper and common speech. For starters, within the realm of common language, you have a whole host of dialects, jargons, and argots. The basic idea behind all of these is that people who spend a lot of time together in a specific context inevitably end up developing their own language within that context. For dialects, that context is the actual geographical region, whereas for jargons, it's some sort of commonly pursued activity, think military or professional jargons. Now, both dialects and jargons can prove quite impenetrable to outsiders, but in these cases, this obscurity is purely accidental or at least unintentional. It simply comes from a certain background knowledge that outsiders lack. Argos, on the other hand, are specifically meant to obscure because they function as a sort of gatekeeping or identifying people who do or do not belong to a certain group. The most common example here is criminal argot, but really any group of people who have reason to be suspicious of the outside world can and often do develop their own. Now, this diversity of common language is widely known and recognized, but we often tend to think of upper class language as this sort of standardized, homogeneous monolith, which is very far from the truth. And a great example of that is the ton of Regency England. Around the turn of the 17 and 1800s, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, the middle classes started to amass quite a bit of wealth, so much so that a lot of them were able to break the barrier and essentially buy their way into the upper class. And the old money did not like this one bit. Lacking any legal means of preventing these social climbers from mingling with them, they resorted to the second most effective option, which is good old-fashioned peer pressure. The elitist of the elite started developing an esoteric set of mannerisms, fashion sensibilities, and speech patterns collectively known as the ton. This etiquette was famously in such constant flux that by the time anyone could write it down and publish it in a handbook for the masses, it was already out of date. And that pretty much was the entire point. The closer a family was to that elusive inner circle, the sooner they could adopt the latest ton, which served as their status symbol. Although it's set considerably later, G.B. Shaw's Pygmalion does have a great example of this. As part of her dialect coaching, Higgins teaches Eliza the phrase "to do someone in" as a synonym for killing, which is part of the latest ton and therefore identifies her as fashionable. So if you want to depict a really decadent upper class in your book, these kinds of details go a long way. But circling back to the social divide, one pitfall that I still see a lot of beginner and sometimes experienced fantasy authors fall into is equating lower class language with crudeness or outright vulgarity, which is not only unfair, but also untrue. Medieval peasants weren't educated, but they were still humans, and as such, they appreciated wit, whimsy, and creativity just as much as you and I do. They just had a different frame of reference. The idioms of the upper class often drew inspiration from art, philosophy, and world history because it was a way for them to show off their schooling. Meanwhile, the language of the lower classes was mostly influenced by practical things like nature, folklore, trades and professions, and local history. One of the most enlightening experiences I've had was when I was studying Latin in college, and my professor helped me realize that the reason so much of ancient humor just isn't funny to us isn't because ancient people hadn't figured out humor yet, but rather because so much of it is just inside jokes and contemporary references. Admittedly, this is really hard to pull off in a standalone book of fiction, but if you're writing a series, one great way of giving your world a sense of cohesion is to have people reference past events in conversations that are not about those past events. Okay, so those were the general influences. Now let's talk about specific use cases. That is to say, what are the actual idioms and expressions that you will need to come up with? Well, I would say the first and most obvious one is greetings. How do people say hello and goodbye? Are there different ways to do it? And if yes, how do they decide which one to pick? Is it just based on time of day, like good morning, good afternoon, good evening? Is it based on a level of familiarity, like hello versus how do you do? And which of these are considered appropriate in different situations? And I can give you a really good example of just how subtle these things can get. In my native language of Hungarian, there is a greeting, csókolom, which has very specific use cases. The basic idea is that this is how you greet someone that you do not have a close relationship with and who is visibly at least one generation above you. So typically this will mean children greeting adults who are not in their family, or adults greeting elderly people who are not in their family. But the additional twist here is that while this greeting is considered respectful, it's not considered proper. If Hungary had a queen and you met her and you said "Chokolom," you might mean it with all due respect, but you would get laughed out of the room. And as a matter of fact, there is an entire speech pattern in Hungarian that falls into this limbo category of respectful but not proper. Now, is this kind of thing possible to both invent whole cloth and reflect in an English language work of fiction? I would argue probably yes, but you would need to be very careful with it because there's a lot of nuance you need to communicate to your reader without launching into a full-on info dump. On top of hello and goodbye, there's also a host of idioms related to specific social situations that you'll probably need to consider. Think meal times, giving and receiving gifts, wishing someone well, and so on. For these, the most practical advice I can give you is to just get a foreign language phrasebook and then go over the idioms listed in that, at least as a starting point. And then, of course, besides wishing someone well, there is also the topic of wishing someone ill, namely swear words and interjections. The first thing you'll want to consider here is your target audience, and I'm not just talking about age groups. Different subgenres of speculative fiction come with different reader expectations. For example, if you're writing classic Tolkienian high fantasy, then your readers will probably expect an elevated level of literary value, and for many, that is incompatible with the notion of cursing. Other subgenres, like low or dark fantasy, don't usually have these kind of reservations. As a matter of fact, I had one reviewer call my books prudish because they're categorized as low fantasy, but the harshest word I use is piss. This was actually a conscious decision on my part, and it wasn't just born out of propriety. Besides the idea that Ardan would be a secular culture, I also imagined them as having a history as a seafaring nation, and so I thought it would be fun to reimagine some of their vernacular in that context. Now, I myself am not a sailor, but some of the things I imagined these people wishing upon their worst enemy is for their ship to sink and for them to sink with it. So they ended up having phrases like rot in the deep dark or rot in the cold depth as an insult, phrases like drown me to express surprise or I'm sunk if someone's in a hopeless situation, and even longer phrases like it would be a dry day on the seafloor before something unlikely happened. This is one approach you can take, but by no means the only one. You can just as well use perfectly ordinary English obscenities, or you can play around the censors and just invent a nonsense word that you present as if it was a swear word from your world's native language. But keep in mind that this can very easily run into the translator problem that I mentioned in the previous video. I remember beta reading a novel where characters threw around the word sard, which I kind of acknowledged as, okay, this is the swear word of this world, but then a couple chapters later, the author just threw in the word shit, which kind of made me question the whole point. And then lastly, besides situational phrases and swear words, there are also just any number of idioms and proverbs that you can come up with. Now, you can spend any number of hours inventing these ahead of time, but a more practical approach that I can recommend is to simply pay attention to your dialogue as you're writing and editing, and look for those opportunities where you can maybe swap out a native English phrase with something that fits more neatly into your world. And if you're really committed to the bit, one thing you can try to do is to invent fossilized phrases. These fall into a broader category known as semantic demotivation, which is basically where a derived word, compound word, or even an entire phrase stops being recognized as the sum of its parts and just becomes its own entity that means one specific thing. A great fictional example of this is in a famous episode of Star Trek where Captain Picard lands on a planet and he tries to communicate with the locals, but even though they have universal translator technology, he still doesn't understand what they're saying because the translator translates everything word for word, and most of their language is made up of these fossilized phrases that refer to things from their mythology and history. Or, for a real-life example, I can once again direct you to my native language. You see, if you spend enough time listening to Hungarian conversations, you might end up hearing people say things like hat or no hat, what's 30, or screw your lawnmower. On the surface, these are all complete non sequiturs that have nothing to do with their context, and that is because these are actually punchlines from old jokes that many people don't even know anymore, but they fossilized into idioms in their own right. As with the metaphors and references that I mentioned in common language, these can be very hard to pull off, especially in a standalone book, but if you can, they really add a lot of flavor and a lot of personality to your world. Finally, to close out the video, there are two caveats that I would like to bring to your attention. The first of these is that while I had a lot of fun inventing the maritime-inspired swear words of my world, I also made sure to mix those with completely ordinary English ones because there is a very fine line between a vernacular being themed and one note. One example that comes to my mind, and your mileage may absolutely vary on this, is the religion of Westeros in A Song of Ice and Fire. Specifically, the new religion, which is based around the pantheon of 7 gods and revolves entirely around the number 7. Their holy symbol is a 7-pointed star. Their temples are called septs and have 7 walls. Their priests and priestesses are called septons and septas, and they carry 7-sided crystals. And on the surface, this all makes perfect sense, and that's kind of the whole problem. Because real-life cultures, and especially religions, are never this neat. If you just look at Christianity, there is an entire cavalcade of metaphors and symbols and iconography because real religions aren't invented by one person. They are the definition of a collaborative effort, and a lot of people will contribute a lot of different things that are just accepted into this cultural mass. This ties back into something that I mentioned in a previous video about systemic world building, namely that if you spend a lot of time thinking about your world from a god's eye view, there's always a risk that it becomes a little bit too clinical because it's lacking that sort of human chaos that makes it come alive. The other caveat is that as you're reading through your dialogues and looking for those places where you can swap out an English idiom with a more world-specific one, it can be very tempting to go the hold your hippogriffs route, which is where you basically take one word from an English expression and swap it out with something that's a little more closely tied to your world. The hazard with this is that it can very easily land you in a sort of linguistic uncanny valley where it's different enough from English that readers immediately notice what you're trying to do, but it's similar enough to English that they can tell you're not trying very hard. The end result is that if you do this a lot, it can make your world building feel a little bit cartoonish. Now, if that's your intention, by all means go for it, but if it's not, then I'd say reconsider. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments, and until next time, stay tuned.